I'm not the kind of guy who writes stuff like this. I don't read cryptid forums at night. I fly survey drones, and I go home to my wife and kid. The only reason you're listening to this is because I saw something out at an old coal site that I can't explain, and I just need to get it off my chest. If you want to call the thing I'm about to describe a werewolf, go ahead. All I know is that it isn't any animal I've ever heard of. It has made the abandoned site its territory, and from what I saw in there, is a dangerous predator that has spilled human blood. I live in West Virginia and work as a survey tech and drone operator for a small civil engineering firm. We're the kind of outfit counties hire when they don't have much budget, but need someone to map a site and do basic assessments. The job that put me in front of that thing was just another brownfield survey on paper. Fly the drone, get photos of the old coal tipple and conveyor system, and stitch it all together for a redevelopment proposal. The site itself was one of those abandoned coal facilities you see scattered around here. A steel tipple with a conveyor running over a hollow, down to where trains used to load. Abandoned for decades. The county wanted to turn the place into a light industrial park. This was just a preliminary data grab, and counties pinch pennies, so they cut it down to send Mark with the drone. The plan was to drive out, fly a few circles, and be home for dinner. It doesn't get much easier than that in my line of work. It was late fall, cold, but dry. I left the office after lunch, drove out along a 2-lane that turned into a narrow county road, and followed the directions to a dead-end spur that climbed up to the old site. Cell reception was gone as soon as I turned off the main road. That's normal out there. Half the places we work are like that. The old dirt road that led up to the site was in a terrible condition. It had been washed away in several spots, but I had been warned about that. No big deal. I parked about half a mile from the gate, got out, and pulled my gear. Hard case with the drone, remote, and 2 extra batteries. Then I started walking. Up close, the place felt bigger than it had on the satellite images. The tipple towered over everything. Dark, rusted steel against the sky. Catwalks and stairs zigzagging around it. The conveyor ran off at an angle, up on its own steel trestles, crossing the hollow like a skeleton of a bridge and vanishing into the tree line. Below it was a rough gravel pad where trucks must have parked once. Grass and saplings had started to take it back. No lights, no power hum, no signs of life. Immediately, it felt too quiet. If you work outside a lot, you notice those things. Some sites have a kind of background noise, bird, dogs barking, that sort of stuff. Here, it was dead quiet. I set up on the pad as it gave me a good view of the main structures, so I didn't have to rely only on the drone camera. From there, I could see the main control motor building off to my right. A rectangular box of corrugated steel with a couple of doors and busted windows. It fed into the base of the tipple, and from there the conveyor ran out over the hollow. Inside that building was where the old motor rooms, panels, and all that would be. The drone was small enough that I could get it in there if I was careful. I unpacked the drone, set it down, and fired everything up. In my head, this was going to be a routine job. 3 batteries, maybe an hour and a half of flying. It was already late afternoon, so I didn't have any time to waste. I sent the drone straight up to about 100 feet and did a slow circle around the whole site first. That's standard for me. You get a feel for the layout and check for any tall surprises like loose wires or poles. On the screen, it all looked normal. Rusted steel, broken roofs, brush pushing in from the edges. I took a few wide shots of the tipple and the conveyor trestles, marked a couple of points of interest on the map, then made a few close-up passes. Most counties don't care about pretty pictures. They want to know what's going to fall down first and how much it'll cost. That means I try to get the drone into places people don't want to climb. In this case, that was the conveyor housing and the upper levels of the tipple. The conveyor was basically a long, covered tunnel made of sheet metal and steel ribs, running up and over the hollow. Parts of the siding had rotted away, which actually helped me. It gave me openings I could fly through without threading the needle too tight. I brought the drone down to maybe 20 feet above the gravel, then eased it toward one of the open sections of conveyor. The video feed showed the underside of the structure as I approached, flaking paint and dangling strips of old belt. Inside, it was dark. I bumped the camera exposure up a little and used the drone's light. The tunnel in front of me turned into a narrow rectangle, steel floor where the belt used to be, ribs along the sides, and daylight leaking in from holes here and there. For the first 30 seconds or so, it was just dead space, no movement whatsoever. Then the picture jumped slightly as the drone corrected for a bit of turbulence from its own prop wash. When it stabilized, there was something at the far end of the tunnel that hadn't been there before. At first, I thought it was just a darker patch of shadow. It was standing between two ribs, maybe 60 feet ahead, right where the conveyor housing turned a slight corner. I nudged the stick. The shadow didn't move with the structure. It had its own edges. The top of it was close to the ceiling. The bottom of it, feet, paws, whatever, was planted on the metal floor. I remember my brain trying to file it under person, maybe a homeless guy camping in there. But the proportions were off. The shoulders were too wide, the arms too long, and there was hair or fur down the sides of it that caught the light in a way cloth doesn't. Before I could talk myself into anything, the thing reacted. It moved forward 3 steps towards the drone, not scrambling or crawling, upright. The head was low between the shoulders like it didn't have much neck. I saw an ear flick in the light, pointed and laid back more like a dog's than a person's. Then its mouth opened. A split second later, the audio on my controller picked up a low, deep roar or snarl that sounded like it was coming from right next to me instead of 50 feet down a metal tunnel. I flinched and pulled back, lifting at the same time. The drone responded, sliding backwards and climbing a little. The thing came after it. The speed is what really killed any maybe it's a person idea for me. I've never seen anyone move like that in tight, cluttered space. It covered ground like a big dog breaking into a run, but stayed upright, using its hands to catch itself against the ribs and kick off again. Around that point, it swiped at the drone for the first time. The picture jerked hard as something hit the side of the frame. The gimbal fought to level out. The horizon spun, and I got a warning about obstacle avoidance. I thumbed the sticks up and back, more on instinct than anything else. The drone shot backwards toward an opening I'd seen earlier, climbing as fast as I dared inside the housing. I expected whatever that was to peel off after a half-hearted chase, the way most dogs do with cars. It didn't. Every time the drone stabilized for a second, I saw it again in the rear-facing camera, still coming, closing whatever distance I'd gained. Once I cleared the housing and popped out into open air, I took it straight up to around 50 or 60 feet. Get away from it, reset, maybe write the whole thing off as a big feral dog that didn't like the noise. Once I came out over the lip, I realized the thing still hadn't given up. On the screen, I watched it burst out of the same opening I'd used, but instead of stopping there, it grabbed one of the vertical supports and pulled itself up onto the top of the conveyor frame, like it had been doing that its whole life. In that moment, it looked more like a chimpanzee than anything else, the way it used its arms to move, except for the head. Now that it was out in the open, I could see the muzzle was too long for an ape, more like a big German shepherd's, but stunted and pushed onto a body that shouldn't have had one at all. The forehead sloped back hard, the ears sat high and pointed, and the jawline was heavy and overbuilt, like it was made for biting through bone. Dark, coarse fur covered most of the head, but around the face, the skin looked bare and tight, and those eyes were set in a way that looked more human than anything. From there, it ran along the spine of the structure, right under the drone, head tilted up at the sound. Every time I drifted a little, it adjusted. I pushed higher, hoping it might finally lose interest. The drone climbed and climbed. I kept waiting to see the animal slow down and drop away. It did slow, eventually, but not in an I'm tired kind of way. It stopped on a wider section of grating near the base of the tipple, planted its feet, and just followed the drone with its head. It knew it couldn't reach me at that height, but it wasn't giving up. It was tracking. At that point, my heart was pounding hard enough that I could feel it in my throat. I didn't have a file folder in my head for huge creature on 2 legs that looks like a cross between a dog and an ape, so I shoved it into the closest folder I did have. Angry animal, avoid. The one thing I was thinking clearly about was the drone. I'd seen it take a swipe and almost knock it down. If it dropped it, that was a couple grand gone, and I'd have a lot of explaining to do back at the office. So I switched from get away from the thing to get the drone somewhere safe where I can figure out my next move. For me, safe meant back over the open gravel pad where I was standing. No vertical structures right next to it. Clear line of sight, easy landing. I swung the drone around, lined it up, and sent it back toward my position in a shallow descent. On the map overlay, it was just a little triangle sliding along a path back to home. What I didn't really register in that moment was what the animal was doing while I was busy staring at the screen and watching my altitude. I had to make sure I cleared the last bits of steel and didn't clip any cables on the way back. That's all I cared about. I watched the landing pad grow bigger in the frame, watched the little crosshair line up with where I was standing. I remember feeling a weird mix of fear and relief. Fear of whatever I'd just seen in there, but relief that the drone was out of its reach. Later on, thinking back, that was incredibly stupid. I just watched something impossible chase my drone through a metal tunnel at full speed, take a swing at it, and then track it up onto a steel frame. And my whole brain narrowed down to one thought: bring the drone back so I don't lose it. It never even crossed my mind that whatever was chasing it might just keep following it, right to where I was standing. The drone was on final approach when everything went to shits. I was so locked into that little rectangle of video and the numbers on the controller that the rest of the world narrowed down to noise in the background. What snapped me out of it was movement out of the corner of my eye, off to the left, not on the screen, in real life. Something big and dark flashed between two support columns under the conveyor and then broke out into the open. For a split second, my brain tried to make it into a black bear, because that's the only thing that made any kind of sense. Then it came fully into the open. It wasn't upright anymore. It had dropped down into some kind of four-legged gallop. The front half of it was too long and too high off the ground for a normal animal, and the back legs kicked underneath it like a big dog at full sprint. The strides were huge. Every time it hit the ground, it launched itself forward, eating up 10, 15 feet in a single bound. The shoulders were rolling. The head was low and hung strangely off to one side. That was the exact moment I realized what I'd done. I'd let it right to me, like a kid dragging a string with a toy on the end, and then acting surprised when the dog follows it back to the couch. All that careful flying, all that thinking about saving company gear, and I'd never once asked myself what happened if the thing chasing the drone decided to come for me instead. I dropped the controller without even thinking about the landing. My body was already moving before my brain caught up. I turned and ran for the closest thing that looked like cover, a big open set of steel doors at the base of the tipple. Both leaves were propped open when I'd flown past them earlier, showing nothing but dim space inside. The gravel under my boots felt like marbles. I could hear the creature's footsteps behind me, heavy impacts that didn't sound like paws so much as someone in work boots hitting the ground, only faster and heavier. I didn't look back. All I focused on was the dark rectangle of that doorway and the idea that if I could just get something solid between me and it, maybe I'd survive. I hit the threshold at a half stumble, grabbed the edge of one door, and swung it with everything I had. The hinge screamed, but it moved. I grabbed the other leaf and yanked it in, stepping backward into the gloom of the building as I did it. Both doors slammed together with a hollow boom that rang through the steel. There was a push-bar-style latch on the inside, one of those heavy industrial ones that throw steel pins into the frame. My hands were shaking so hard I almost missed it, but somehow I got both bars depressed and heard the pins slam home. A second later, something hit the doors from the outside. It felt like a truck had tapped the building. The steel bowed inward, and the whole frame shuddered. The sound of it, metal flexing and a deep, angry roar on the other side, went straight through my chest. The doors held, but just barely. Whatever was out there hit them again and again, claws screeching on metal between impacts. That was enough to get me moving. I backed away from the doors until my heel caught on a piece of scrap, and I almost went down. The interior of the tipple swallowed me up in dim, dusty light and shadows. Old equipment, Catwalks and stairs faded into the gloom above. I turned and headed deeper into the structure. I didn't have a plan beyond put as much distance between you and that thing as possible. Once I got away from the doors, the noise from outside dulled a little. The building was huge inside, bigger than it looked from the pad. Above me there were at least 3 or 4 levels of catwalks, platforms, and chutes. Big motors and gearboxes sat on concrete pads, all of it dead and covered in grime. Every sound I made, every footstep, every breath, bounced around and came back at me from a dozen directions. There was still some light bleeding in through busted-out wall panels and broken windows up high, but it was thin and gray. Deep inside the structure, it turned into more of a suggestion than anything you could walk by. After about 20 feet, I pulled my phone out to use the flashlight. No reception, just like before. The pounding on the front doors went on for a bit longer. Then, just like that, it stopped. For a couple of heartbeats, there was total silence. No banging, no claws on steel, no wind. I froze in place and held my breath without even meaning to. That's when it let out the howl. It came from just outside the structure and rolled through the steel and concrete like a siren. I've heard coyotes my whole life, packs of them yipping and howling on the ridges. I've heard wolves on videos. This wasn't either. It was deep and full, and it went on and on. The sound seemed to start low in its chest, climb up in pitch, then break into something almost like a scream at the end. It sounded wrong in every possible way. There was something in it that hit a switch in the back of my brain I didn't even know I had. Pure terror. If you want to talk about the fear of God, that's about as close as I've ever come to understanding that phrase. And yeah, as dumb as it sounds, standing there in an abandoned coal tipple in West Virginia with my phone light shaking in my hand, the first stupid word that popped into my head was werewolf. I pushed it away at first because it felt ridiculous. But if I put the pieces together, the way it moved on 2 legs and then on 4, the shape of the head and the ears and the muzzle, that howl, it fit that picture better than anything else I had. I kept moving. The inside of the tipple was basically a maze. There were stair towers going up to higher levels, narrow walkways over open drops, and little rooms off to the sides where they'd kept tools, parts, and electrical gear. I was looking for anything that smelled like daylight and fresh air. A side door, a loading bay, even a hole in the wall I could squeeze through. I had to get back to my truck somehow and get the hell away from that place. On the first level up, I pushed through a maintenance door and found nothing but dead control panels and a wall of conduit. No exit. Back out, up another set of stairs. The metal groaned under my weight and flaked rust with every step. At one landing, a side door looked promising until I saw the handle had been cut off and the whole frame tack-welded shut. As I worked my way along one of the intermediate floors, weaving between old motors and hoppers, the beam of my phone cut across something on the ground that didn't look like scrap. I almost stepped on it. It was a pile of bones and trash pushed up into a corner. Food wrappers, torn cardboard, bits of wire, and in between them, lengths of white and yellowed bone. Some of them were small, like from raccoons or possums. Some weren't. A couple of the longer ones had clear crescent-shaped gouges on them, where something with big jaws had bitten down. A little deeper in, near what looked like an old loading chute, a new smell hit me. Meat. Fresh enough to still have a sour, metallic edge. The light picked out a shape in the shadows, and my stomach dropped. It was a dog. A German shepherd by the look of it, though half of it was missing. The rib cage was stripped on one side, the head still mostly intact. The collar was still on, cheap nylon with a metal buckle, and there was a short strip of leash still clipped to the ring, frayed and chewed through. That told me 2 things I really didn't want to know. 1, whatever was living in here was strong and bold enough to take somebody's pet. 2, it wasn't just passing through. This place was its den. The worst part came just minutes later. I'd made it down a set of stairs to another level when my light hit a different pile of fabric and trash. I saw belt loops and pockets, jeans, a work jacket, all of it shredded and torn, stained dark in places that never cleaned up. They were piled in a way that said somebody had been dragging them there. Lying just off to the side of that mess was a bone I recognized immediately. Human bones don't look like animal bones if you've seen enough pictures. This one was a forearm. Radius and ulna still together, with the hand attached. There wasn't much flesh left, but there were still dried tendons around the wrist and bits of skin clinging to the back of the hand. The edges of the bones were chewed, gnawed down in places with the same wide, deep bite marks I'd seen on the others. I stood there a long couple of seconds, phone light fixed on that hand, and all the excuses I'd been making fell apart. Whatever that thing was, it had been hunting in and around this structure for a while, dragging bodies inside and feasting on them. That's when I heard it again. It was a bang, then another, somewhere below me in the guts of the tipple. Not like the earlier impacts on the front doors. This was inside, carrying up through the framework from underneath. A few seconds later, I heard claws on steel, a scraping sound that moved, paused, then moved again. I killed my light instinctively and just listened. The noise shifted position, like it had dropped back down onto a lower level and was now moving along one of the main beams or walkways. Every so often, there was another hollow thud as it moved around. The message was pretty clear. The doors weren't my problem anymore. The thing that had been out there howling was now inside, somewhere below me, working its way deeper into the structure, and as far as I could tell, looking for me. I didn't see a good option at that point. Going down toward the noise was suicide. Going higher at least put more metal between us, so that's what I did. I found the nearest stair tower and started climbing. I moved slower, trying not to make every step ring like a bell, but even careful steps made plenty of noise in that kind of structure. I kept expecting to hear the thing answer me from below with another howl. Instead, all I got was the occasional creak of steel shifting and my own heartbeat in my ears. About halfway up the tower, I saw what I'd been hoping for. A small, boxy room built onto the side of one of the platforms. Concrete walls, a narrow strip of wired glass along the top, and a single metal door with a regular handle. It looked like some kind of control room. I eased the door open and slipped inside. The room was maybe 10 by 12 feet. Old consoles lined one wall, covered in dust. There was no other door. No big convenient window I could climb out of. Just that single door back to the platform and a bunch of conduit running up into the ceiling. It wasn't much, but it was 4 solid walls and a door I could lock. I shut it as quietly as I could and checked the hardware. There was a standard latch, and above that, a heavy manual deadbolt that slid into the frame. I turned both. The deadbolt handle was stiff with rust, but it moved. That did more for me in that moment than any prayer could have. For the first time since the doors at ground level, there was something solid between me and that thing. Then there was nothing to do except wait, listen, and try to come up with a plan to get out of there. I had maybe an hour of daylight left, at best, and I had no intention of spending the night anywhere near that thing. People talk about time slowing down when they're scared. I can tell you that's true. I stood in that little room with my back against the wall, phone light off, and just counted breaths in my head. I'd gone from being terrified of every noise to being terrified of the lack of noise. The scraping and banging below had stopped again. No footsteps, no claws on steel. I know exactly how long the quiet lasted for as I kept checking my watch. 19 minutes. Long enough for my brain to start trying to bargain with reality. Maybe it had gone back out. Maybe it only came inside to check and left when it couldn't catch my scent. Right about the time I started to believe that lie, it found me. The first hit on the control room door was so sudden and so hard that I thought the whole wall had come loose. The metal boomed like a drum, the deadbolt snapped against its seat, and the strip of wired glass rattled overhead. I heard the creature on the other side before the sound of the impact even finished. A deep, drawn-out growl. It hit the door again. The bottom edge bowed inward a good inch, maybe more, and sprang back. The deadbolt held, but the latch screamed. I could see the handle jump with each blow. Between impacts, there was another sound. Something like big hands or paws scrabbling for purchase on the metal, claws biting in and dragging down. I tried to back away, but there was nowhere to go. There's not a lot you can do in a 10 by 12-foot concrete box with one door and no weapons when something that size wants in. That's when I looked up. The ceiling was low enough that I could see the whole thing once I flicked the phone torch back on. There was a rectangular duct running along one side, a ventilation shaft. A square grill, maybe 2 feet by 2 feet, was bolted over an opening near the corner. The door shook again under another hit, and that made the decision for me. I dragged a broken chair under the grill, climbed up on it, and started pulling. On the 4th or 5th attempt, one of the bolts gave. The whole assembly shifted. I grabbed the edge of the grill with both hands and pulled like my life depended on it, because it did. The remaining bolts squealed and then let go all at once. The grill came down in my hands and clattered onto the floor. Behind it, the duct was dark and full of dust, but it was open. The door took another hit while I was half in, half out. This one bent the panel enough that a thin line of light streaked across the floor from the hallway. I heard the deadbolt groan. I didn't wait to see if it would hold another one. I shoved my shoulders into the duct, squeezed my chest through, and dragged my hips after. The opening was wide enough for me, but there was no way the werewolf would have been able to squeeze itself through, which gave me some relief. Once I was fully inside, I pulled myself forward with my elbows. It wasn't a nice, clean HVAC line like you see in office buildings. It was old, industrial ducting, with seams and braces every couple of feet that caught my knees and boots. I left the phone light on, as it was completely dark inside the shaft. Behind me, the control room door took at least one more hit. This one sounded different, more like a full-body slam than a strike. There was an awful tearing noise of metal giving way, then a heavy thump that I felt through the duct. I didn't hear the door tear off its hinges completely, but I'd bet good money it was hanging by a thread after that. I kept crawling. The duct turned once, then again, roughly following what I thought was the outer wall of the tipple. Every so often I heard the creature moving in the structure around me. A heavy step on a platform below, claws skittering on a catwalk to my right. A low, frustrated growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once through the steel. At least once it sounded like it was directly above me, pacing along a roof beam while I inched my way through the intestines of the place. Eventually, a faint gray light showed ahead of me. One panel in the ductwork had rusted through at a seam, opening a jagged hole maybe a foot across. I wriggled up to it and peered out. Below was an exterior catwalk bolted to the side of the tipple, maybe 15 feet above the ground. Beyond that, I could see trees, the gravel pad, and a slice of the sky. The light was dim and had that late evening, almost night quality. I'd been inside longer than I thought. I worked the hole wider with my hands and boots, careful not to slice myself open on the edges. When it was big enough, I eased my legs out first, felt for the handrail with my boots, and then dropped my weight onto it. The catwalk rattled under me but held. I crouched there for a few seconds, listening. No immediate reaction, no impacts on the wall. From that catwalk, there was a short set of stairs down to a lower landing, then another down to ground level on the far side of the structure from where I'd come in. I moved as fast as I could without breaking into a full run, every nerve in my body waiting for the sound of heavy footsteps behind me. All I heard was my own breathing and the small clangs of my boots on steel. When I finally stepped off the last stair onto gravel again, it felt unreal. The air outside was cold and damp and smelled like leaves and rust instead of meat and dust. I was on the opposite side of the tipple from the main doors, with the bulk of the structure between me and wherever the creature was inside. I stayed hidden as far as possible as I worked my way back toward the pad. I moved along the wall, staying low, pausing at every corner to look and listen. The yard was empty. No sign of movement under the conveyor. No sounds from inside the structure either. The spot where I'd been standing when all this started was just ahead. My landing pad, the hard case, and the patch of gravel where I'd first seen it break into the open. The drone was on the pad, props still, lights off. At some point after I'd stopped steering it, it must have set itself down automatically. I quickly folded the drone away, grabbed the hard case, then started back towards my truck. That half-mile felt a lot longer on the way out than it had on the way in. The light was going fast. The trees on either side of the washed-out track closed in, and the old ruts were just dark scars in the dirt. I kept my head on a swivel the whole time. Every snapped twig in the woods made me flinch. The only good news was that there was no sign of the creature between the tipple and the road. No movement in the brush, no howls. I let myself believe it was still inside the structure, tearing the place up in a pointless search for me. By the time I got close enough to see the spot where I'd left the truck, it was getting hard to make out details. The track crested a small rise, then dipped down toward the bend where the road had washed out. The truck was parked just beyond that, parked on the last reasonably flat, solid ground. From there I had a partial view down the road. The outline of my truck was right where I'd left it, dark shape against the lighter dirt. I felt a rush of relief for half a second. Then I stopped dead in my tracks. Something was moving around the truck. At first, all I saw was a shadow against the side panel. Then it shifted, and I could make out the shape of a head and shoulders. That damned creature was pacing along the driver's side, nose running along the doors and windows like it was trying to figure out how to get in. Every now and then, it straightened up a little, put one hand on the roof for balance, and leaned in close to the glass. I eased back down and swore under my breath. Whatever hope I'd had that it would lose interest and stay in its den was gone. When it lost track of me, it must have picked up the scent trail I left when I walked up to the site earlier. All my hope died right there. Even if it was just for a moment, there was no way I was getting inside that truck without being torn apart. But then I had an idea. I slid the drone case off my shoulder and set it down. My hands were still shaking, but years of repetition took over. I flipped the latches, popped the lid, and pulled the drone out. Then I swapped the dead battery for a spare one, and I set it down in the middle of the trail. When the video feed flickered to life, I felt a weird sense of déjà vu. Same little rectangle, same telemetry, totally different stakes. I switched over to waypoints, then set the altitude to about 20 feet, following the terrain. I dropped waypoints all along the forest road for roughly a mile and told it to hover at the end. The idea was simple. Give it something loud, bright, and annoying to chase. That wasn't me. That's how this whole mess had started. The drone rose off the ground with its usual wasp buzz, louder than I liked in the quiet. But I had to trust the tree line and the distance to mask it for a few seconds. Once it was steady at 20 feet, I turned it toward the road and sent it forward along the preset path. On the screen, the camera cleared the brush and locked onto the track. A moment later, the truck slid into view from the right side of the frame. The creature was there, back half turned, head down near the bumper. The moment I switched the lights on, it reacted. The head snapped up. It turned in one smooth motion, shoulders twisting, and for a second, the camera caught its face full on, eyes reflecting the LEDs, ears high and forward, mouth slightly open. Then it lunged. I kept my thumbs off the sticks and let the autopilot do its job. The drone stayed on its path, low over the center of the road, moving faster than walking pace, but slow enough that something determined might think it could catch it. On the feed, the creature broke into that same weird four-legged gallop I'd seen earlier, but this time it wasn't coming at me. It was going away, up the road, chasing the drone. I watched long enough to be sure it was committed. Once it had covered 20 or 30 yards past the truck without looking back, I dropped the controller against my chest on the lanyard and broke cover. I have to admit, I felt pretty damn smart in that moment. Despite everything, it was working. I could hear the drone whine away up the track and, faintly over that, the creature's snarls, farther and farther off. Seconds later, I hit the driver's door, yanked it open, and all but dove inside. I slammed the door, hit the lock button out of pure reflex, and twisted the key. The engine turned over on the first try. I had made it. On the controller screen, sitting in my lap, the drone's camera still showed the track below, and the creature jumping and swiping again and again. Something huge and furious was chasing a toy it couldn't quite reach. The damn thing wasn't quite as smart as I had thought. I didn't stick around to see how that ended. The waypoint progress bar crept forward. The drone was lost in any case. I just kept my foot in it and drove, putting as much distance as I could between myself and whatever I'd stirred up out there. When I finally got reception, there was a text from my boss asking for a quick status update and a couple of sample shots for the client. I stared at the screen for a long time before I answered. In the end, I kept it simple. On my way back, site is in rough shape. Got enough data for preliminary. We'll debrief tomorrow. That was true, as far as it went. It just left out the part about the thing that had almost killed me. At home that night, I had to make some tough decisions. The raw footage from the card I had pulled before sending the drone away had everything. My wide orbits, the close passes on the tipple, the run through the conveyor, and clear enough glimpses of the creature that anybody watching would know they weren't looking at a bear. I watched those sections once, then copied the whole lot onto a USB drive I keep for personal stuff. After that, I deleted anything with the thing in it from the working folder. No second guessing. What I kept were the kinds of shots you'd expect from a survey. Wide overheads of the site, close-ups of rusted-through catwalks and stairs, and stills of oily staining on the ground under old motors and at the truck loading area. Anywhere the ground looked darker than it should have, I grabbed a frame and marked it possible contamination. I also pulled stills of the access road, washed out sections where the ditch had eaten half the track, standing water in deep ruts, sections where you could see fresh slope slumps and undercut shoulders. I made sure these frames showed just how unstable that access was. I didn't use any images from inside the tipple that showed bones, the dog, or the pile of clothes. Instead, I chose angles that suggested other problems, close shots of flaking paint on structural members I tagged as suspected lead-based coatings, crumbling insulation on old piping I marked possible ACM, and a couple of views down into dark, debris-filled pits and sumps labeled unknown contents. Further investigation required. I wasn't lying. I was just very selective about what I showed. The next morning at the office, I wrote up my field notes and the safety incident report. The field notes were dry. Extensive debris accumulation, road in poor condition, requires complete reconstruction. All true. The incident report was where I pushed harder. I described being approached and chased by a large, unidentified canid-type animal, size comparable to a large black bear, in and around the tipple. I wrote that it showed highly aggressive territorial behavior, that it attempted to breach an entry door after the operator sought shelter inside, and that I was forced to retreat via elevated catwalks to avoid physical harm. I didn't say it ran on two legs or looked like something out of a movie. I just made it very clear that whatever it was big, aggressive, and still there. In the recommendations section, I wrote that any further work on site should be contingent on comprehensive hazard mitigation, including reconstruction and widening of the access road to safely support heavy equipment and emergency vehicles, a detailed structural assessment by a specialist team with standby rescue, a Phase 2 environmental investigation and full hazardous materials survey before any demolition or redevelopment design, engagement of wildlife control or state agencies to address the predator before sending additional personnel, and a strict prohibition on solo site visits. A week later, after the engineer had turned my notes into formal language and added his own worst-case cost estimates for access, remediation, and demo, the memo went off to the county. The short version was simple. If they wanted to turn that site into a light industrial park, they were looking at a multi-stage, multi-year job with a lot of money burned before they even saw the first building pad. Between the bad road, the unknown contamination, and the wildlife issues, there were cleaner, cheaper parcels to pick from. I never saw the county's full response, but I heard enough in the hallways. The project manager mentioned they were putting the coal site on the back burner and asking us to quote work on a different parcel closer to the highway. I didn't call the sheriff about the bones or the clothes. I know how that sounds. Part of me still wonders if I should have, but any formal investigation would mean sending more people into that structure. Deputies, crime scene techs, and animal control. They would have walked in there without a clue about what they were truly up against. It would have been a bloodbath. I couldn't have that on my conscience. But that wasn't a clear-cut decision. The creature had fed on at least one person after all. So this is what I've done instead. On paper, in the official world, That old coal tipple is just another bad site. Too much rust, too much contamination, too many unknowns, and not enough budget. Everybody has a normal, boring reason to stay away from it.